The weaponization of anti-Semitism is one of the biggest threats to the Jewish community, and here's why. Anti-Jewish hatred is an abhorrent evil and has been in existence for millennia. Like all other forms of bigotry, society must do everything it can to root it out and eradicate it from our institutions, our organizations, and in our community. Sadly, much like Islamophobia and other forms of bigotry, anti-Semitism is on the increase as society becomes more polarized, driven by right-wing media, right-wing fanatics, and right-wing governments all over the world, including right here in the UK. And, of course, there can be no more right-wing and extreme than the Israeli government and the coalition of tyranny put together by Benjamin Netanyahu, a coalition which includes a self-defined fascist and a convicted supporter of terrorism. Israel's government has been at the forefront of nuclear-grade weaponization of anti-Semitism. So let's take a look. In January 2024, the Israeli Foreign Ministry described South Africa as the legal arm of Hamas and disparaged them as anti-Semites following the submission of their genocide case to the ICJ. They accused South Africa of invoking old anti-Semitic blood libels, clearly disregarding page after page after page of evidence submitted to the court showing clear Israeli atrocities. They later followed that up by describing the International Court of Justice itself as anti-Semitic, and it refuses to abide by any of its rulings. Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett called the ICJ hearings the Dreyfus affair of the 21st century, referencing an infamous anti-Semitic prosecution of a Jewish officer in France over 100 years ago. Bennett went on to say, "This is a shameful display of hypocrisy and blatant anti-Semitism." The ICJ isn't the only UN body Israel has attacked. Israel has worked hard to undermine the legitimacy of UNRWA, the leading humanitarian aid organization for Palestinians, calling them Hamas affiliates and labeling them as anti-Semites. An article in the Jerusalem Post this year claimed that UNRWA was indoctrinating Gazan children to hate Jews and was promoting anti-Semitic ideologies, with absolutely no evidence presented in the article. And of course, there's been an ongoing campaign to label the entire United Nations as an anti-Semitic organization. Gilad Erdan, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, has been continuously calling for Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, to resign over his staunch criticism of Israeli atrocities. It doesn't stop there. Israel refuses to allow Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur for Palestine, to enter Israel or Palestine, engaging in an ongoing smear campaign against her. And you guessed it, calling her anti-Semitic for her continued highlighting of the plight of Palestinians. Most recently, in a dramatic, or rather embarrassing scene, the Israeli ambassador addressing the UN General Assembly used a miniature shredder to shred a miniature copy of the UN Charter. The last person to do this at the General Assembly was previous Libyan dictator Colonel Gaddafi. It's not just global institutions that have been the target of the smear campaigns. Over the last 6 months, we have seen global protests on the streets of most major cities in the world. Israel's response to this was to call them anti-Semitic hate marches, even though many of these protests involved and were even organized by the Jewish community themselves. University divestment movements have also been defamed and called anti-Semitic, despite the fact, again, many of those involved and many of those who have been arrested are themselves Jewish. Let's hear what Netanyahu had to say about them.
What's happening on America's college campuses is horrific. Anti-Semitic mobs have taken over leading universities. They call for the annihilation of Israel. They attack Jewish students. They attack Jewish faculty. This is reminiscent of what happened in German universities in the 1930s. It's unconscionable. It has to be stopped. It has to be condemned, and condemned unequivocally. It's also because they say not only death to Israel, death to the Jews, but death to America. And this tells us that there is an anti-Semitic surge here that has terrible consequences.
Even the biggest and most prominent human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have been labeled anti-Semitic by Israel. In 2022, the Israeli Foreign Minister called Amnesty International, yes, anti-Semitic, for releasing a report that presented the findings of a study which concluded that Israel was engaging in apartheid. The statement from Israel reads, Amnesty's report effectively serves as a green light to harm not only Israel but Jews around the world. The organization uses double standards and demonization in order to delegitimize Israel. These are the exact components from which modern anti-Semitism is made. Its extremist language and distortion of historical context were designed to demonize Israel and pour fuel onto the fire of anti-Semitism. It went on to lobby for the report not to be released, effectively attempting to silence criticism of Israel. Closer to home, Israel has no issue calling Jewish Israeli critics of the country themselves anti-Semitic. An example of this is Yuval Abraham, an Israeli Jewish filmmaker. Israel's Khan public broadcaster aired a segment about Abraham's comments in which it characterized his comments as anti-Semitic, and he has even been called a self-hating Jew, a go-to label for Jews who refuse to accept Israeli tyranny. And finally, in the last few days, the chief prosecutor at the ICC has announced his application for arrest warrants to be issued to Israel's officials, Netanyahu and Gallant, and more to follow. Of course, the response was predictable, and Prime Minister Netanyahu called the prosecutor a Nazi-like anti-Semite and invoked horrific yet deliberate analogies to the Holocaust and the Nazi regime. So, in summary, Israel has labelled the UN as anti-Semitic, UNRWA as anti-Semitic, the International Criminal Court as anti-Semitic, the International Court of Justice as anti-Semitic, the Chief Prosecutor of the ICC as anti-Semitic, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International as anti-Semitic, global protests as anti-Semitic, Israeli Jewish filmmakers, and even the nation-state of South Africa as anti-Semitic. In short, anyone who even remotely considers criticizing the state of Israel is labeled an anti-Semite. This isn't just comical and ludicrous, it's viciously dangerous. You see, those who cry wolf and weaponize anti-Semitism as a tool to shut down criticism are doing the work of the anti-Semites themselves. They are providing cover and a distraction for what is real and increasing anti-Semitism in society. They distract attention from the true bigots by instead focusing attention on critics of oppression and injustice. They also dilute and diminish the impact and the seriousness of the term anti-Semitism. When they label everything as anti-Semitic, nothing really becomes anti-Semitic, and society becomes apathetic and unresponsive to the term. Israel are not making the Jewish community safer. Today, they pose the biggest threat to Jews. And the clearest sign that this is true is embodied in the words of Israeli Jewish filmmaker Yuval Abraham after his speech calling Israel an apartheid state. Israel's Channel 11 aired a 30-second segment from my speech and insanely called it anti-Semitic. And I've been receiving death threats ever since.